Welcome back to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about living in the tension of being in the world but not of it. We've got a really unique episode today that I cannot wait for you to hear. And the reason why we're releasing it right now is because we're getting ready for a big event at our church called How We Love Weekend. And it's going to be a couple days of really diving deep into an amazing resource called How We Love by Mylan and Kay Yurkovic. And this is a resource that's really changed a lot of lives. I know for me and my wife, Kate, reading through it has been eye-opening, just seeing so many of the different ways that we relate to each other that we don't even realize we're saying certain things or expecting certain things of each other. And it's been helpful for us to grow in our relationship. But whether you're married, whether you're single, whoever you are, this is a resource designed to help you relate to people better. And so we're really excited for that event. We'll put details in the show notes for you if you want to check that out. But the conversation we have today is from a couple who has had a life-changing experience going through How We Love. Steve, you want to tell everybody about that?
Yeah, you're going to meet Bob and Dani Collins, and I think the thing that is going to stick out to everybody, I mean, it just jumped out at all of us when we did the interview, is how raw and vulnerable and honest they are about not only the pain they went through with an affair, even them reliving it. You'll hear it's still very, very hard to talk about, and yet the incredible grace that comes through from God's forgiveness, his intervention in our life, is incredible. And of course, they'll reference How We Love too, which was a huge benefit for them.
Awesome. Let's jump in.
All right. Well, this is another Native Exiles first. We have taken the show on the road. Here we are with our crew down on the distant shores of Portland, Oregon, visiting with some friends of mine, Bob and Dani Collins. Thanks for having us down here, you guys.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, welcome to Portland.
Really glad this worked out. The reason we wanted to do this is a little bit of a departure for us at Native Exiles. We're usually talking about like weighty cultural or theological issues, you know, like deconstruction or LGBTQ issues in the church. Today we get to hear an amazing story from you guys, a hard story, but a really cool story of God's grace working through some really hard times in your life. So really appreciate you guys being willing to be vulnerable and just share a really encouraging story that has some pretty tough spots along the way. So we're going to get in a moment to the crisis moment, but the crisis moment didn't hit till well into your marriage. You guys were married 35 plus years. Tell us a little bit about those first 35 years. Where were you guys? What were you doing professionally? Tell us about Bob and Dani Collins.
Go ahead.
Well, we lived in Federal Way, Washington. We went to Christ Church, raised our kids there in that church. 3 kids, John, Bo, and Nicole. Wonderful kids. And lots of wonderful grandkids from them. But we didn't have grandkids then. Oh, yeah, we did. We had grandkids during all that. Anyway, and we, you know, kind of a bit of our story is that we found out later is that, you know, Bob, from the time of Bible college to everything that he did and our busyness around the time that crisis hit.
You were busy.
We were busy. We were really busy, and we're doing so much ministry. Bob was the elder at the church. I was a women's director, and we just had, you know, a lot going on. We would do some counseling in our home, and you know, just a lot of stuff. So we had a lot of things going, and I think Bob was looking forward to retirement, kind of like the carrot on the stick. You know, that whole idea of when we retire, everything's going to be so great, and everybody's telling you to get ready for retirement, and all those commercials. And
yeah.
Anyway.
And so, Bob, you were looking forward to retiring from what?
From law enforcement. I had 27 years in. This was in 2000. In 2011 is when I retired. And in 2010, I was planning on putting in 30 years.
Yep.
At the time, I had just come out of internal affairs. I was acting operations commander, so I was always on call for any incident that happened to patrol. If they needed a SWAT team called out, if they were having staffing issues, anything that was just happening, officer-involved shooting, I was called. I was also the public information officer, so I had a pager where the media could get a hold of me 24/7 if something took place, and they would get a hold of me. I would find out what it is they're interested in. And our chief was really, a priority was if they did want an interview, they wanted us in uniform, in front of the camera.
Yep.
And so I was the person, whatever time of day it was, 2 in the morning, get up, get dressed, go in, do my FaceTime, do interview with the media. And so, very busy time for me. And a lot of stress.
I can imagine.
And I got to the point, and added to the police work, I was an elder at the church, and there was all that's involved there. And so it got to the point where I realized, especially in the police work, a couple of incidents took place where I realized I just didn't want to do this anymore. And I was turning 53 in 2011, and that was an age in Washington State where you could retire. One could retire with benefits and no penalties. And so I remember coming home and telling Dani, I said, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore.
Wow.
And I went ahead and got a hold of the guild rep and said, start the paperwork as soon as you can. And I was retired in July of 2011.
So I met you guys, I think, the first time wasn't too long after that. We have a common connection. Your sister-in-law, Linda Collins, longtime, much adored worship leader at Alderwood Community Church, where I serve. Linda's a dear friend of mine. I'm very interested in counseling. And so the connection was, I think you guys were in town one time, and Linda said, hey, we should have lunch together with Bob and Dani. And so we were talking about things. I think you had just retired. Life looked really good, really perfect for you guys. You were still serving at the church. Kids had moved out of the house. You had grandkids in your life then. You had just retired. Everything looked really good. And in fact, you had the perfect marriage, right?
And I just remember standing out on our deck one day thinking, Lord, this is amazing. I have everything I ever wanted. I had retired, actually stopped working also for the church, and was just doing the ministries I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And it was just perfect. I could have grandkids when I wanted them. I thought, life really just can't get better than this.
So everything seemed perfect.
Yeah.
And then life changed dramatically. By the way, Bob, I'm 53, so I think we should take a break right now, and you can fill me in on how I can retire this year. We're going to take a break and come back and talk about how life changed very dramatically for Bob and Dani Collins after year 35. So Bob and Dani, there you were, 35 plus years into your marriage, and things were going swimmingly, perfectly. You had the ideal marriage. You just retired, Bob. And Dani, I think for you, the great shock hit first. So what happened? What completely upset your world about that time?
Well, Bob just seemed kind of depressed and distant. And I think it's interesting because in his story, it all started with me. I'm a bit of a ding-a-ling and have all kinds of fun little quirks. And one of them is I talk a little too much on the phone when I'm driving. And I had to back the truck I drove into our garage. I had to back it in, and I bumped the side of the garage. And I got out and looked, and I thought, oh, he'll never know. He'll never notice this. And because those kind of things are a really big deal. And I know I should have told him right away, but it's just a really stressful thing because it's not that he gets angry, but he's just being disappointed in me. I don't like anybody being disappointed in me. But I looked at it and I thought, I think it looks great. You can't even tell. The bumper looks great. Anyway, so he had been retired for, 6 months, and he had been painting in the house and doing all this stuff. And he says, hey, honey, come here. Come into the garage. And he goes, our bumper's crooked. Did something happen? I'm like, oh, I did it again. Honey, I did it again. Sorry. And walked back into the house. I was just so defeated that it did have damage and I didn't notice it. And I did it again because I've done that sort of thing many a times.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so a few months after that, I can't remember how exactly it happened, but he let me know that he didn't love me anymore. And that there was some things that I really needed to change. And for some reason, I don't remember the whole list, if there was a list, but one of the main things was that I was doing too much ministry, and I cared more about the women that were calling me and needing help and stuff than I did about him. He didn't feel loved. And so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I was devastated.
Yeah.
And right at that moment, my whole world fell apart. I didn't tell a single soul. I didn't tell my mom, which she was shocked. I didn't tell my best friend, who I told everything to. Didn't tell any of my kids. But we were doing a lot of counseling at that time. And one of the couples that we were counseling, he was suicidal.
Wow.
And it just really threw Bob. And it just really threw him. He was crying and talking to this guy. And anyway, I decided I needed to tell our pastor over counseling. And I went to him, I said, I just need you to know that Bob is really struggling right now. And I don't know exactly what's going on, but he's really struggling. And I wasn't completely honest to tell him what Bob had said to me. But anyway, so that was kind of the beginning of it. And it was about, I don't know, I think it was probably about 9 months of that was going on. And then one day, do you want me to keep going?
No, this is good. I do want to talk for just a second about the emotion. You said for you, it was devastating knowing just that Bob was disappointed with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, that would devastate anybody, but for you specifically, Dani, you were feeling that, oh my goodness, Bob's just not happy with me.
Yeah. And I, being a good wife, and, I talked about being a wife all the time in women's ministry, and it was just like a huge part of my life.
Yeah.
And I had failed.
Oh, wow.
And I just felt like the biggest failure and so much shame.
Yeah.
Like, I am not a good wife. And, and I can't remember what the other things were, but I was just like, I've done what I'm supposed to do. How could he be disappointed in me? It
can't be.
And so I just prayed about it. And I worked so hard at changing these things. I think, another one was like, when I call, I want you to answer the phone, but I might be been in counseling or in a meeting. Or, I never had my phone on because I can't stand a phone to ring. And so I started turning my phone on all the time. And I would interrupt no matter what I was doing. I would answer his call. And I was just trying to do everything of the things that he had
get
mentioned.
things back on track.
To get things back on track.
Yep. Yeah. But the big crisis was not the bent bumper in the garage. There's 9 months leading up to this. Bob's disappointed with you. You're feeling the shame and the weight of that. What, Bob, was the turning point in the marriage, would you say, at that point? I mean, she's disappointed. When did things really hit the fan?
Well, as far as the timeline, the incident with the truck and the bumper was significant, and I'm trying to think in the timeline where it took place. One of the things when I retired from police work is the court was needing a marshal to work for the judge to take people into custody and take them to jail. And I was fully equipped to do so because I had my weapon, I still had my bulletproof vest, and I was trained.
Yeah.
And they were really short. And financially, work part-time, get some extra money. It was perfect thing to do. Mm-hmm. The stress was off me from police work. It was a very low-stress job working for the court. Where I was really still experiencing a lot of stress was the responding to issues at the church, especially with Dani and women's ministry. It was a constant.
So you guys were getting a lot of these couples that needed counseling and a lot of stressful situations.
And this is another thing that I did that really was difficult for Bob, and that's that I think I had this savior complex with the counseling that if a couple needs counseling, we need to help them and Bob just knows scripture so well, and I just loved the way that he taught during counseling, and he was just so helpful. And so, we'd hear of another couple that needed counseling, and I just kind of talk him into it. And when he had already told me, I can't do anymore. And he's in this bit of a crisis, but I'm pushing him.
Yeah. So you guys are busy. You're starting to feel some of the shame of knowing you've disappointed Bob. You're feeling some of the stress of ministry just kind of taking over. What happened next?
Yeah. Like Dani just mentioned, one of the things we were doing both premarital counseling and we were doing marital counseling.
Yeah.
And we had two premarital counseling going on at this particular time. We had the other marriage counseling with the one gentleman, like Dani shared, suicidal, dealing with, for example. And I was really feeling overwhelmed. And I communicated to Dani saying, you know what, let's just finish what we have, but don't add anything to our list or, what we have, what we're doing. And sure enough, it seems like within a few days, he goes, hey, there's a young couple at the church. They really are interested. They're talking about getting married and doing some pre-counseling. Let's meet them. I told them we'd meet them Saturday morning at a local, little restaurant, and we can talk about it. And so already I'm thinking, I'd asked to let's not add anything, and she's adding something. And so I was feeling that pressure, and I was feeling like that's her priority. And getting back to the court work, I still had my locker at the police department. And that's where I would go to change. Instead of my police uniform, now my court uniform.
Yep.
Well, at the police department, the chief secretary was someone that I would regularly see when I worked at the police department. And that's where the coffee was. So I'd get into my uniform, I'd go get a cup of coffee, and I would chat with this young lady who's 10 years younger. And I just found a very enjoyable time just talking to her. And it just, that was just, I looked forward to it.
Yeah.
And I continued it.
Not stressful.
Not stressful. It was the opposite of stress, just very enjoyable.
Yeah.
Very relaxing, enjoyed it. And so I'd even show up a little bit earlier to get into uniform to have a little more time. And that just led me down a road where I ended up leaving my wife for this woman.
Wow. Dani, when did you find out? Did Bob tell you? Did you discover it? How? I can't imagine. How did you find out?
Yeah, well, it was in February when he said he didn't love me anymore and these changes. And then it was in May that he invited my parents to come over. And I was also, when our middle son, Bo, him and his wife were on vacation, and we were watching 2 of their children. And so I had a baby, and I had a 2-year-old,
More stress.
at the house. And he asked my parents to come over, and I'm like, oh, what are you guys doing here? Oh, Bob asked us to come over. And so we were standing there, and he says, I just need to let Dani know that I'm leaving you for another woman. And I was...
Wait. So you announced that to Dani and her parents?
Yeah, to be accurate, as far as
Wow.
her parents had not arrived yet, but she could tell when I got home that something was up. And I remember she was in the kitchen. We had kind of a real big open floor plan where when you come down the stairs, from upstairs where the bedroom is, and the bedroom's upstairs. As I'm coming down, I remember her looking up at me. She asked something like, is there something the matter?
So you sensed it.
I sensed it. Yeah.
And I said, Dani, I got a bombshell to drop on you, is my words. And her parents had not shown up yet, but since she had initiated it, as far as something's up, and I said, I've got a bombshell to drop on you, and that's when I told her. Wow. Yeah.
What was your first response?
I just really was in shock. I really wanted my parents to leave. I didn't want anybody to be there. And I said, this isn't good timing, because on top of that, our daughter had a friend coming in town to go to a Bob Goff conference, and she was staying with us. And I was picking her up at the airport in like 20 minutes.
Goodness.
And so I go, this isn't good timing. And he goes, well, there's never good timing. And so I'm just sitting here thinking, what am I going to do? And so he just went and packed his stuff and left.
Immediately. As soon as you made the announcement.
Yeah.
Actually, what's interesting is on my mind, I had worked at the court that day, and I was driving back, and I was going through my mind, I'm going to tell her, this is the time. She had contacted me, hey, I need you to pick up some stuff at the store. So I'm going to the store and picking up some stuff, and then I get home, and then we already shared, hey, I got a bombshell to share with you. I had forgotten about her, the fact that there was somebody pick up at the airport that day.
Oh.
And so she, I think she was expecting for me to do it. And but anyway, bottom line is she ends up going out the door and does the pickup, and Denise's parents are still there.
Wow. So you're alone with her parents after the bomb has been dropped. Yeah. That must have been...
Oh, that's right, because I had to leave. Yeah, and I left. I didn't want to leave the baby with him because he didn't even know him. I mean, he was like 9 months old. Yeah. So I put that baby in the car and left the toddler and drove to the airport and picked up my daughter's friend, and we just caught up. And then I said, because I knew her pretty well, she was coming from Arizona, and I said, so, the Lord knows everything. And he knew you were flying in today, and he knew what was going to happen today. And so I've got some bad news I need to tell you. And so I told her, and I said, but that doesn't mean you can't stay with us. You can still stay with us. You can do whatever you want. I know this is super uncomfortable. I said, I haven't told Nicole yet. Oh, nobody knows. This just happened. And so, and I brought her and I showed her Nicole's bedroom. I said, you can stay in here. Nicole was off at college college. No, she already had a job in Cincinnati at that time. And so I said, you can just use the guest room. It wasn't Nicole's room. It was our guest room at that point.
That's not awkward at all.
No, not at all. And so when I was driving back, Bob had said, I'll call the kids. And so, I'm a pretty submissive wife. And so I'm thinking, okay, he's in charge of calling the kids to let them know. And all of a sudden I was like, no, I can do whatever I want. He just left me. I mean, I was just so in shock. So I called my oldest son, John, and I said, John, I have something to tell you. And I told him, and he said, I'm on my way right now.
Wow.
And so he drove from Portland up to Fife, Tacoma area where we lived, and came up and called the in-laws of my other son. Can you come pick up these boys? Because I was just going to continue to watch the kids. And anyway, he took care of everything.
God bless John. One of the things that came to mind when we were kind of rehearsing this story the other day is something I run into so often in marriage counseling, which I do some of, is just recognizing that you can be married for 35 or 40 years and still be just completely oblivious to each other's inner world, what's going on. And so here you guys both are, and your whole marriage, your whole world has been turned upside down. You clearly are in totally different worlds. What happens next, Bob? How long do you stay? Are you out for a long time? How long did you move out for?
It was just about a week. And realized that wasn't going to work. And
what changed your mind?
Well, it was interesting. I had actually moved in with this lady, and I was on my way. I had stopped by. In my plan, I had met with all the boys face to face.
Your sons?
My sons, during the week. And I also wanted to meet with our pastor face to face. And anyway, the day I met with the pastor face to face with Jeff, then I went by my dad's and just sat with him for a little bit. And then I was headed to this lady's house, my new home. And I get a text from her, and she says, don't come home until you divorce your wife. Don't come here until you divorce your wife, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I pulled off side of the road, and I tried calling, and no response. And I just thought, you know what am I doing? And I decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to the house. And I thought she was in Portland. I'm going to get some things. I'm driving to Portland, and I'm going to repent, and I'm going to say I made a mistake, and let's make this work.
So you drive down here?
I didn't. I actually, when I drive home, which wasn't very far from my house, I drive up, and there's John's car, my son Bo's car, and we had a long driveway. And as I'm driving up, John comes out of the house, immediately looks at me like, "What are you doing here?
Wow,
you're not wanted here." And I remember I got out of the car. I remember I can even visually see I left the car door open. The car's running. I said, "John, I'm back. I was wrong." And I remember John hugs me. Bo comes out. He hugs me. Starts crying. And then we went into the house. And, of course, my daughter-in-laws are there. My daughter's there. Danny's there. And John says, "Dad, walk us through this. Talk to us."
The structure's right now, again, for people who are listening, but it's palpable in the room. Again, I just really appreciate the two of you being so vulnerable with us. This is not easy to tell, and you're being just very honest and candid. I really appreciate that, and would love to say, right, that Bob's back, and it's been a week, just a really tough week, maybe a tough year, and everything's back to good, right, Dani? Everything's just right on track.
Perfect again. Perfection again.
And that lasted how long?
Oh, it didn't last at all. Well, we ended up going to Portland with John, both Bob and I, and Nicole, because Nicole had flown out from Cincinnati.
Your son, John, daughter, Nicole.
Yeah. And then after a few days, Nicole flew back home thinking everything's okay, or at least starting to be okay. And we actually went on John and Tristan's vacation, which is definitely could be a pretty funny movie. Tristan and I laugh about it a lot.
You guys have so many stories, which I've learned. What was the vacation?
It was a drive in a motorhome that they rented, and Tristan was pregnant and nauseous with her second child, and she's got her in-laws with her that are, a mess. I mean, you don't know people that are as a mess as we are at that moment. And I mean, I'm having panic attacks anyway. I had panic attacks the whole week and was a mess. And I mean, my issues, I was a mess. And he was a mess, but we didn't know his issues.
Some vacation.
Anyway, it was a vacation from, and anyway, yeah, so we did that. And then we were there with them for a while. And we just thought, we're ready to go back home and maybe get some counseling from our church. But we were such a wreck that the sweet friend that was helping us through it, he didn't have a chance because we had so many layers of a wreck that we didn't even know ourselves. And by the end of the summer, we had just Bob. I kind of kept thinking that Bob was, if he was going to come home, he was going to be, he did ask for forgiveness, but he was going to go, I love you so much, and how could I make such a mess? And you are so amazing. And but he came back and he didn't love me still. He wanted to do the right thing, but he didn't have that feeling of, he was so detached.
His heart wasn't in it.
His heart wasn't in it. We couldn't talk about anything. I tried and tried and tried. And all he could really think about was her.
How long did that go on?
So this was in May, and it went on until Women's Bible Study was starting up again, and that was one part that I was in charge of. And so that started, meetings started with that, and he called her. Or is that what you did?
It went till September.
This was actually in October.
Okay. Yeah. And you called her and you went back to her?
Yeah. Yeah. I was, when I came back to Dani, I obviously came back physically.
Yeah.
But it was clear, I learned in a short amount of time after I had returned, that I was still very emotionally attached.
Yeah.
And I'd never had a substance addiction of any kind. But I just could imagine what it's like to have an addiction, where I've heard stories of people basically giving up everything because of the substance.
Yeah.
And nothing else mattered. And as I look back, it was like an addiction. And even though I was physically back, I am trying to fix myself. Other people were trying to help fix me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were so addicted to this woman, or at least the idea of what she represented, you basically were willing to sacrifice 35 plus years of a happy marriage, potentially your relationship with your kids,
my Christian walk and testimony. Yeah.
I'm really thinking about the phrase you used a minute ago, Dani, just layers. And obviously the layers extended beyond what had just preceded in the 9 or 12 months before what happened. You guys finally were able to start on a road to healing. And I want us to just pause for a minute, and we're going to take a look in our next segment at how God brought you out of this very dark, hopeless situation. Well, that story was not easy to hear, not easy to rehearse. I mean, this is, 8 years back, and still some pain in your eyes. But thankfully, God is an amazing God, and the gospel's real, and God's reconciling us, not just to himself, but to each other. And that's what I love about your story. Dani, you and we're counseling experts. We know everything about what the Bible says to wayward sinners. No, that actually wasn't your experience, was it? I mean, when you found all this out, how did that go? Like, you had this circle of counseling friends. How did it go with them? Did they have answers? Were they helpful? What happened?
Well, my best friend, I'll say her name because she will love that if she listens to this, but Teresa was a huge help, and she was one of the counselors too. And she was very gentle with me and just helped me through things, which was just really wonderful. As things went on, and she even said right away, I can't remember what the two things were, but she says, right away, you're worried about what people think, and you, what was the other thing? Anyway, she was just really helpful, and she helped me through a forgiveness, thing, and she's just really a solid friend for me.
Were you able to forgive Bob? I mean, there was round 2. You went all those months of just being physically present but not emotionally present. I know there's a lot more mess to the story that we don't have time to tell. Were you able to forgive Bob? How long did that take?
Forgiveness wasn't hard. And I think that's all Jesus, obviously, because I'm a very sinful person. And anger would be one of my issues in life, along with anxiety. But I'm not even sure how to say it, but I just could not stop loving Bob. And I wanted the best for him. And I just don't remember forgiveness really being a big issue. What my biggest issue was, I was scared to death to be alone. And so, and I wanted Bob back in my life, but after twice, no.
That's painful.
I mean, fool me once, fool me twice.
Yeah.
Boy, I am done with this. And my best friend even went with me to an attorney and just to figure out which direction to go and kind of all of that stuff. And there's no reason to jump into getting a divorce. But for me, that was kind of the only thing I could do. It wasn't like, oh, he's having a crisis and we've been having all these fights and stuff. He left me for another woman. Yeah. So he's planning to marry her. So that's something I could do is start the divorce part, and just, I think it kind of was like, this is the only power I have. And it wasn't in anything meanness. It just was something I knew was going to happen. And I wanted to protect myself because he was not, he was not the Bob I knew.
You were justified, which is what the church tends to look at. Okay, she has biblical grounds, and so this is sort of cut and dry. But God gave you grace to forgive Bob, and you still loved Bob. Bob, you came back after round 2. Where was your heart at after round 2?
Well, when you use the phrase, I came back, we were separated because she had moved down to Portland. The second time around with the other woman was a week, and without going into detail how things fell apart there, they fell apart. And I was at my house all by myself and very lonely and crushed, and realized I had definitely destroyed my marriage, Dani's life, my kid's life. And I started a couple of times reaching out. I called and left a message for her. I remember calling Jon because their second son was born, and I calling him saying, hey, I'd like to come down and see, your new son. And he basically said, Dad, you've got issues you got to deal with, kind of. Wow. And he basically said, no, don't come down. And I left the house and moved in with my sister because I just felt, even though I kind of like being isolated and being alone when dealing with issues, but I was at a point where I did not want to be alone. At the same time, it's interesting, I really didn't want to be with anybody else.
That's a pickle.
Yeah. I just wanted to hunker down, but at least I hunkered down at her house. And, she, married in big house, and I wasn't intruding, and they welcomed me. And anyway, Tristan, Jon's wife, recommended that I go see a counselor.
Individually?
Yeah. And so they found a couple of names in the Tacoma area, and I went to one. I went about 3 times. I think it was once a week, and it just wasn't, whatever it wasn't working. Whatever this guy had was sharing with me. I mean, I kind of shared a little bit with Tristan, I think, over the phone. This was kind of what his counsel was, and it's like, yeah, you're right. This is not good. And I said I could sit over a cup of coffee and talk to somebody and feel like I'm getting the same kind of counsel. Yeah. And so it's when they recommended that I come down to Portland to what's called Refuge, but it was a group for people who were broken, struggling with substance abuse or perhaps sexual abuse when they were younger, or even adults. But they recommended I start a Refuge group.
And Dani, weren't you down here in Portland with Jon and Tristan at that time? So you're both down in Portland at this point, but you're living separately.
Well, to be a little more accurate, I'm still up in the Tacoma area.
Okay.
And she's in Portland.
Got it.
And I'm driving on a Monday night.
I see.
2.5 hours to attend a refuge group for a couple hours, and then I'm driving back home.
And was that helpful?
Absolutely. The group was absolutely helpful.
Yeah.
And in addition to the group, we started marriage counseling every other Tuesday.
Wow.
So I'd come down on a Monday night, and when we had the counseling on the Tuesday, I'd find a place to spend the night with somebody from Refuge, and then meet Dani. I'd pick her up at my son's house, and we'd go to the counseling, and then I'd bring her back to John's house, and I'd head back.
So we're getting a glimmer of hope at this time. You guys are on a road potentially back to help and healing, but I know that was a long road. And I'm still intrigued with what you said earlier too, Dani, that, I mean, it's one thing to forgive someone. Like, that's the right answer. We're Christians. We know what the Bible says. That doesn't just suddenly solve everything. That doesn't just heal the marriage and get it back to where it's moving in a positive direction. There's more work than just forgiveness. I know for some people it's all about forgiveness, but you guys wanted to get to the root of your problem. Was the counseling helpful in getting to some of the roots of your problem? Did that take a while?
Well, there were several things that were super helpful for me. One was I just thought there was really something wrong with me, that I could still love a man that had done that to me. And I know a lot of it was because we had a good marriage. I didn't have a husband that was mean to me, or, you know.
Until it wasn't a good marriage.
Until it wasn't a good marriage.
Yeah.
And then also, I was really into this right and wrong thing. There's a right and there's a wrong. And especially when it came to cars. I mean, this is a little thing, but it was a big thing in our marriage. And I wasn't into cars. And a car is just to drive to A to B. It doesn't matter what it looks like, or, you know, it's just not a thing for me.
Yeah.
And Bob was into a car, and that it looked nice. And I should take care of our cars, you know, obviously. Anyway. And one day she said, you know, you guys need to get over that. There's not a wrong way and a right way. You know, Bob has this pretty little car, and he can keep it just as nice as he wants. And Bob, let her have her own car and let her do what she wants with her car. Yeah. And if she makes a mistake, leave her alone, you know, and don't give her a hard time about it. He realized, you know, that was a big deal. And I went, there's not a right or wrong.
Wow.
And then she says, no, there's so many things in marriage that we think are right and wrong. And we're going to stick on those things. And I thought I was pretty right that, you know, we should be into our possessions like this. And she said, no, you know, the only right and wrong thing when, you know, of all those things is how much is in your checking account. There's a right and there's a wrong. And you know, there's
numbers add and subtract.
Exactly. And that just really stuck with me. Now that might be silly because we've got all these big marriage issues, but there's little things along the way that you've held, you know, I held my whole entire married life that this is right and this is wrong. And she was just saying, you know, so many people are caught up, especially older generations, of it has to be this way.
Yeah.
It's got to be my way. This is right and that's wrong. And
so that was a breakthrough for you, moving
really
from the categories
seem
of
silly,
it has to be right or it has to be wrong, and my way is probably right. I know no other married people can relate to that at all. Yeah, no, that's a common one for a lot of us. Bob, what about you? Was there a breakthrough moment maybe early in the counseling?
Well, first of all, I just want to say, as far as what little contact Dani and I had, how forgiving she was, how gracious she was, how supportive she was of wanting our marriage to work.
What did that do to you?
It definitely motivated me. It was like, yeah, God wants to make this marriage work. You want to make this marriage work? I want this marriage to work. What's interesting, a couple of things happened in counseling that was really eye-opening, and this was early on, and Dani had to remind me of a couple of things. But I do remember, you know, I'm the one that brought us into this mess and ruined her life, our marriage, and like we already talked about, you know, our family. And I was crushed. I was a pretty broken man. How I totally just destroyed so many lives and my own. And so I was hurting. Yeah. Dani's hurting. And when the counselor heard the story, it was either the first session or the second session, it was early on, she said to me, Bob, you're traumatized. And what was interesting to me was that definitely how I felt. I'd never really used the word consciously, being traumatized because of all that took place. But it just landed, and I thought, that's so true. I am. I realized Dani's traumatized, but I am too. And she recognized that, and that gave me some hope, that somebody realizes I'm damaged.
Somebody
I'm broken.
named what you were feeling.
Yeah. And that really landed big time. And then she also said in one of the sessions, she says, Bob, you love your wife, but you know what? Right now, you don't like her. And I thought, wow, I don't like her, but I do love her.
Yeah.
So that just was, as simple as that was, it just, yeah, I love her. But I was in a season where I didn't like her.
Yeah.
And so, again, she's the counselor. If she's identified that, I realize she probably has a roadmap to work us through this.
That's a great phrase, roadmap. And let's just spend the remainder of our time talking about that roadmap. There's so much more we could say, but one of the reasons we're doing this particular podcast, Telling Your Story, is because we are inviting to our church in February Milan and Kay Yurkovich, who wrote a book called How We Love. And I know that book was really instrumental in helping you guys find some of those things you needed to heal. You talked a minute ago, Bob, about being traumatized. And I think from what I know of your story, the trauma wasn't just what had happened in the previous year. The counselor was poking at some other things in your heart besides the previous year, like maybe some things you'd carried even since childhood.
Well, definitely. One of the things early on, I think it was part of that counseling, part of Refuge. And talk about Refuge for a minute is the first content of the material that I went through with a group of men for the first 3 sessions, which were 6 months long. Was it 6 months for each session? Is I really didn't feel like I got much out of the content. I won't mention what it was, but it was just being with men that were broken, that were hurting, struggling, transparent, authentic. And just that group dynamic was obviously vital. And I think that's a group dynamic that every church needs to have. And that as I look back on the church, that culture I was in, I either didn't see it, or I was either blind to it or wasn't there. And I think one of the big things was, and the counselor brought out, was I was just emotionally, I was immature. I had emotions of a 4-year-old.
And that didn't just happen when you were 53 years old.
Right.
That had been there for a while.
Right.
How did you kind of come to terms with that? How did you start to see that in yourself?
Well, what was big is, the timeline with How We Love talks about the different love styles, and I realized that I was an avoider. And a lot of that had to do with how I was raised as a child and how emotionally I did not receive comfort from my parents. And in identifying the earliest time I can remember an incident where I didn't get the comfort and I needed it. And I remembered I was about 6 years old, and I know how old because it was my aunt died, my great aunt, my dad's aunt. And so that was the first time I had experienced death firsthand of somebody I knew.
Right, you're 6 years old.
And my family was not Christian. We didn't have Bibles. We never went to church. And when I say this, I double-checked with my brother and my sisters, and I said, did I miss something? No, not at all. We never prayed. Even at Christmas time, no Christmas story. I mean, it was void. And so I had nothing really beyond what I can see and taste and touch as far as what life's all about. And so I remember coming out of my bedroom, and I'm just wondering about death and my aunt. And my mom was walking down the hallway, and I stopped her, and I said, Mom, what happens after we die? And I was hurting, struggling, needing some kind of answer. And she looked at me, she said, Bob, nothing happens after we die. There's nothing. And she just kept walking. It's not like she said, hey, let me give you a hug.
No
how
emotional
you doing?
comfort, no hope.
Just that interaction. And I'm giving you pretty much, that's how it went down. And the thing is, that wasn't an isolated incident. That would be an example or pattern of how there was no comfort in my family as we grew up.
So you didn't know how to process emotions.
Yeah,
and you weren't taught that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I kept hearing these stories during counseling, and I just kept thinking, this little boy, I kept hearing more stories like this that I had never heard our entire married lives at all. And my heart was just breaking for him. I thought, he doesn't even, his parents were great.
Yeah. They did the best they could.
They did the best they could, but emotion-wise, they never ever expressed any emotions, or not the hugs or the I love yous, or none of that. And so he didn't have that.
And that wasn't a condescension from you, that poor little boy. That was genuine compassion. Like, you really realized this poor guy doesn't have any tools to process his emotions.
No, and I just always thought he was pretty much perfect. He didn't have all these emotions, and
yeah.
Yeah, and I might add, and I'm thinking, like Dani said, my parents, I don't want to be hard on them and they're both deceased now, but they can't pass on what they didn't have. And my son, who recently wrote a book with his wife, he basically talked about his dad as being stoic, never showed emotion.
Can I read it? I actually read
that'd be the best way to go.
Jon and Tristan's book, Why Emotions Matter. A little shameless plug here, but I found the passage because, having the description from someone who grew up in your house as your child is probably going to be pretty accurate. Jon says, I come from a long line of family members who ignored their emotions. My dad was stoic, rarely showing signs of emotion, much less talking about feelings with me or my brother. He learned from his parents who didn't display emotions or even say I love you to him. My mom expressed emotions in ways that were unpredictable and unproductive, as if she bottled them up until she couldn't handle it anymore, then exploded, only to begin the cycle again. Dani, talk a little bit about your side of that. I mean, Bob's is the stuffing it, ignoring it, don't process it. What did you learn about yourself in counseling?
Well, it took a long time to get to this, to figure this out, but now my mom and dad are alive, and they're great. Mm-hmm. But my dad was unpredictable. And so... And we had so many rules. Like, I wasn't allowed in their bedroom, and we could never wrestle. There was so many rules of quietness and being wallflowers. And my dad just had a lot of rules. And so when I raised my kids, I was raising them as the fun mom. There isn't going to be discipline. We were just all going to have so much fun. And so we had fun until we didn't, because I just lost it, because you just can't do that. And I remember I'd call Bob and go, Bob, blah, blah, and he'd go, you just have to be consistent. And that just wasn't in my vocabulary, because I wanted to have fun. Yeah. And it was funny because my daughter-in-law, Tristan, it says I approach grandparenting the exact same way. It's all about having fun.
That's allowed, though, with grandkids, isn't it?
Yeah. It's all about having fun. And she goes, I can see how you were the fun mom and just wanted to have fun all the time. So I don't know if that answers that, but that was my side of it. And I would get angry and fall apart. And so the kids were like, why is she upset? She was just happy.
Yeah, you had an imprint, and I'm borrowing now a phrase from the book, How We Love. It's funny, I read the book because of your story. Linda shared with me, because of our connection 8-10 years back, what had happened, and you guys were very open about it. And she mentioned the book, and I read the book, and I had to be honest, my first impression of the book was, oh, here's another one of these psychobabble books that's like tapping into your childhood, and you're not responsible for any of your problems because, your parents made you that way. But the more I've read the book and the more I've reflected on some of my own issues, and now hearing you guys talk, the point isn't that we're not responsible. The point is we do have an imprint. We do have a love style that comes out, and a lot of times we're not even aware that we're a pleaser or that we're an avoider. And so here you guys are, well late into your 5th decade of life, just coming to terms with the fact that, wow, I really do respond that way, and I had no idea. Cutting to the chase a little bit, the book talks about being a secure connector. That's the goal, right? Learning to be a person who is willing to take responsibility for my emotions and my decisions, but also being compassionate to one another. And I've seen that in talking to you guys. How has the counseling, how has the gospel, how has God's healing touch brought you to a point now where there's hope, there's tools, there's compassion in your marriage? What does that look like?
You want me to go first? Or?
Sure.
Okay. Again, getting back, Dani and I were on the road to our marriage healing. Mm-hmm. And as I look back, at least for me, and I don't know if this is true for Dani, but the refuge groups and the contents that we went through, there was one that Dani recommended I would do that she had been through. And that was so the fourth time through, so going into the end of the second year of Refuge, I started that group, and that's where I really got into the emotions and soul words, talking about emotions and describing the different ones.
You mean you can actually talk about your emotions now, Bob?
Yeah.
Still hard. It's still
not
hard.
easy.
Yeah. So this is about the time where, again, I'm thinking how I feel like I'm healing as a person, and this is why I say I can't speak for Dani. And it got to the point where, okay, now it's time for us to really engage better as, now that we're healing, able to work more on our marriage and communication. And it was about 2 years after the incident that we got the book, How We Love. We were in Cincinnati for 6 weeks. One of our grandsons was being born. And so we had a lot of time together because we were staying in an Airbnb for a couple of the weeks, more than that, I think. And we decided we're going to go through How We Love. And we had the workbook and we had the book. And
Tristan bought us the workbook and the book and said, you guys need to do these. Honestly, just
Oh, go ahead.
Jon and Tristan were with us through this. We were living with them still. Yeah. I mean, this is a couple years into it.
Wow.
And they're very invested into us. And honestly, if it wasn't for them, I don't know what would have happened. But they gave us these books. She gave us.
So you guys start working through the book.
Mm-hmm. And that was big. Very big.
And we had some parameters.
Yeah, we had parameters.
Tell us about the parameters,
Sure.
Bob the Avoider. Tell us about
Bob the
those.
Avoider, yeah. This was very stressful for me to be able to, because the content, the material, the content, we're talking emotions.
Yeah.
And who we are and how the emotional makeup makes us who we are and how we relate with others. And it was hard. It was draining. And so I remember telling Dani, I said, okay, we'll do the workbook, but we will sit for 1 hour and we'll go through what we've done in the workbook, but after an hour we'll be done for the day. And we chose a public place.
So you're meeting outside to avoid any kinds of outbursts that's going to keep you tame, and at 60 minutes, not a second passed, it's over.
And he couldn't wait for that 60 minutes.
I don't know if that's accurate. I just know
Well, you were watching.
that's her perception, I believe, that in her mind I couldn't wait.
But it wasn't easy for
But
you.
when it hit 60, I knew I needed to be done. And so we got a lot out of that time.
Wow.
And as far as the answers and sharing our responses and being able to look back at our past and the secure connectors and our emotions and our love styles.
Yeah.
And what really hit big was, I think it was about the fourth lesson, where I was learning that she was a pleaser. I'm an avoider. So I suppress emotions, there are annoyances, I isolate, and don't like when people draw close. And I think people should be able to fix things on your own. Dani's a pleaser. And I came to the realization that her as a pleaser, she needed what I thought was maybe her being too close and suffocating and controlling. I realized her as being a pleaser, and these were things she was doing out of necessity because she had a fear of abandonment, she had a fear of being alone, and that was just her emotional makeup. And it was like a big, wow, she's not trying to control me, she's not trying to rule me, she's not trying to disrespect me.
That's huge.
It's her needs that she's dealing with that I'm interpreting as disrespecting me. I'll use those words. That was big. That was really big because it came down to motives and who she is and why she was doing what she was doing.
So you not only came to understand yourself, Bob, and I hear something there that we were just talking about with you, Dani. There was genuine compassion. It's not condescension. It's not you're looking at that person like they're broken goods. Like you said earlier, Dani, it's not right and wrong. It's this is how Bob's wired. This is how Dani's wired. And it's coming to terms with, wow, it's not what I thought it was. And now I understand. Was there a moment like that for you, Dani, where you had kind of the epiphany of, oh, now I see why Bob is that way?
Going to this incident, we were walking down the street, and it had been over 2 years since I felt any love from Bob.
Wow.
He was committed. He kept telling me, I'm committed to this marriage because that's what's right. And I want things to work out. But,
He showed up, but he didn't show his heart.
and so it's really hard to, you want that whole fantasy of being loved, you
Yeah.
know.
We all
Anyway,
want
and
that.
all at that moment, when he came to this realization that I wasn't trying to control him, which I had been trying to tell him for a long time, that's not my motive. I never knew exactly what my motive was. But anyway, it's like his heart melted and he looked at me with love. And that was the beginning, really, that was the biggest part of our healing process. We had gotten so much help in counseling to, get our feet back, to realize we were even going to try again.
Yeah.
It was June that we started counseling in February. It was June where we thought, well, we're going to try again. And, he had done those studies, and then we did Mending the Soul, which is an amazing study. That's the one he was referring to that had lots of soul words in it and helping to understand a lot of the hurt of the past.
Yeah.
And then we got into this book and How to Heal. And it just, that moment was the beginning of us being able to listen to each other. Before it was like, I was going into this, but what about me? I'm hurt.
Right.
Because right off the bat, why would the Yurkoviches do this? I think the first chapter, I haven't looked at it for a long time, but I think the first in the workbook, it's like, what are some things you don't like about that your spouse does? And for him to dare to even put something there when I was so hurt, I was just like, I hate this book. And so, but by this fourth week, we just kept faithfully doing it because Tristan told us to do it. And I'm a pleaser.
You were gonna,
And we were going to do it. And anyway, that was just the beginning right there.
There's so much more to your story. And here you guys are several years later, which is just a real testament to God's grace. A couple of thoughts, and then I want to get your help to kind of wrap things up. One thing I see listening to you guys that comes to mind as I think about couples that I do counsel is a lot of couples look to counseling as sort of the silver bullet. We just need counseling. And unfortunately, the statistics bear this out, but I see it anecdotally all the time. Couples will go to couples counseling and they don't get help, or they still feel frustrated. And I see that you guys put in the work. I think the number one factor in the success of marriage counseling is to admit I'm part of the problem and to be willing to put in the hard work. There's no silver bullet apart from the hard work and the honesty and the vulnerability. The other thing I see in you guys is, the statement I made earlier, you can be married for 35, 40 years and not know each other. I think maybe a good way to end our time together is to mention that you can be married 35 or 40 years and not know yourself. You can be a stranger to yourself. And I guess maybe I would ask you guys in closing, what would you say looking back over now these 40 plus years of marriage, going through the hard times, seeing God's grace, putting in the hard work, what would you tell your 31-year-old self, early in your marriage that you didn't know then that you wish you did?
Want me to go first?
Sure.
Probably the best way for me to explain it would be taking from somebody else's work. Jeff Bethke, he talked about being a Genesis 1 Christian or a Genesis 3 Christian. And a Genesis 3 Christian is we start with, the Romans Road, or, the salvation bracelet it starts with black, you're a sinner.
Yep.
It starts off with you're bad, you're depraved, you're a sinner, and then walks through, the gospel. And
Which is all true.
Yes, absolutely. Genesis 1 story is God created man and woman in his image, according to his likeness, and he created everything. He said, this is good. And where you start a story really will affect how that story goes and how the story ends. And if you start with you're depraved, you're a sinner, that reflects on your story. But if you start with you're created in God's image and likeness, and as you look more into that, you realize God is a relational God.
So good.
And God, and it's interesting, Adam and Eve, they were naked in the garden, and I thought it was interesting. For the first time it popped out on me, and they were not ashamed. Why bring emotion into this? What's that got to do with anything? But it's there. And why didn't it say they were not afraid or, whatever? But they were not ashamed. And we could go off to a rabbit trail on that. But the point being is God made us our whole being, spiritual, mental, emotional beings. And I would just tell my 31-year-old self is, what? God made you an emotional being. You are an emotional being. And don't ignore that. Don't suppress that. You need to cultivate that in Christ.
even engineers, accountants, and policemen
Yes.
are. Yeah.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Perfect. Dragnet reference. Dani, what about you? If you could go back and talk to your 31-year-old self, your pleaser self, your friend who's about to get married, what would you say to them?
Well, I'll shock you and say, actually, we got married when I was 19 and he was 20.
Wow, so you guys were way in at 31.
Oh, 31, I'd had 3 children. Yeah, the youngest was 5 or now 4 or something. But, I think it would be to really understand God's grace. I mean, I really always thought I understood it, but that it is so abounding and such a treasure that he gives us, and that he loves me so much, and he loves for me to come and to ask for forgiveness. He loves to be in relationship with me, and I think I had so much shame in my life from whatever it was that I sinned or did, that I just didn't want to come to God. And so shame was just a huge shadow in my life.
Wow.
And the biggest problem of healing in the marriage in the beginning was because I had so much shame that I'm that woman that got left. Everybody's going, what did she do?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I just always had so much shame, and which is a whole nother story that could be a whole nother podcast, but it would be working through that shame and understanding God's great love for me, because I certainly understood judgment and I certainly understood other things, but God loves us so deeply and wants to be in relationship with us even when we sin.
Yes.
And so, yeah. And I think too, well, that's a different subject, but yeah, I think that would be what I would tell my younger self.
You honing in on shame, it reminds me that I think in marriage and in a lot of areas of our lives as Christians, we might even feel somewhat equipped to handle fear, but shame is a whole. You both mentioned shame. You mentioned it, Bob, right there in Genesis 3 as one of the first effects of the fall. And I think that's one of the reasons marriage counseling and marriage itself is so hard, because it doesn't just unearth our fears, it dredges up things that bring shame. And shame might arguably be the most painful emotion we face as human beings. And Jesus knows that, and he meets us in our shame and our pain and our brokenness. And man, you guys have just done a huge service to us, a huge gift in being so vulnerable and honest about your story and how Jesus came after you and found you in your shame and your pain and your brokenness and does what Jesus does, brings hope and healing through the gospel. So thank you so much. I would be remiss. I dropped a little thing at the beginning mentioning that we are here in the Bible Project studios. Your son, Jon, is one of the founders of Bible Project with Tim Mackey. And we as a church are super blessed. I know so many believers are, but the Bible Project has done such a powerful job of reminding Christians of that incredible story that does start in Genesis 1, and the Jesus who does meet us in our shame, and that the big story is the gospel is reconciling us all to the God who loves us and made us and to each other, making all things new now and not just in the, sweet by and by. So you guys are a great testimony to that. Thank you, Dani. Thank you, Bob, for sharing your story with us, for inviting us down here, welcoming us. You've been a real encouragement and blessing to us. We are incredibly grateful to Bob and Dani Collins, who were so courageous to share their, at times very painful, but incredible story of God's grace in their marriage. We're really looking forward to our event on February 24th and 25th, the How We Love Weekend. You can find those details out in the show notes. We'd love to have you there. Please continue to follow and subscribe to our podcast. Tell your friends, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on Native Exiles.